Hello and welcome. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C., where we continue Al Jazeera's special Super Tuesday coverage. We'll be taking your calls and your questions as we speak to leading experts about the implications of today's vote. Well, Super Tuesday was meant to be the day when the U.S. crowned its presidential candidates, but this election's been anything but predictable. Senator John McCain, whose campaign was pronounced dead by many observers only a short while ago, is now being called the comeback kid. He's favored to wrap up the Republican nomination today. On the Democratic side, former First Lady Senator Hillary Clinton was once the party favorite, but now finds herself in a tight race with Senator Barack Obama. The uncertainty of the Democratic contest means that the party could see its first real nomination fight in decades. On today's show, we look beyond the twists and turns of Super Tuesday to examine what the results may mean as America heads to the polls in November. And don't forget, we take your calls on this show. You can reach us at the numbers on the bottom of your screen. Joining me now from New Jersey is Melissa Harris-Lacewell. Dr. Harris-Lacewell is Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University and author of Barbershops, Bibles and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought. She's endorsed Senator Barack Obama. Well, here in Washington, D.C., I'm joined by Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, an organization founded at the request of then-President Ronald Reagan. Today, it's one of the nation's leading center-right strategy organizations. Welcome, both of you.
Good to be with you.
Thanks.
Right.
Nice to be here.
Well, Dr. Harris-Lacewell, if I can start with you and ask you, what you see. Well, I mean, it seems voters this time seem a lot more energized, a lot more interested in what's going on. What's been the reason for voters being so mobilized with this election run-up?
Well, I think that's a true characterization of what's going on the Democratic side. It's not necessarily true that this is a more exciting or more mobilizing election on the Republican side. In fact, the Republican side seems to be missing any kind of true conservative, which I think is in fact sort of irritating and off-putting for many Republican voters. But on the Democratic side, there's no doubt that the kind of historic nature of having a white woman and an African-American man, as well as I think the party's almost giddiness about their belief that they can take the White House in November, has led to a very, very exciting primary race.
I have to ask you, Grover Norquist, good to have you here as well. To what extent is this election up in the air? I mean, there's a lot of unpredictability about things. People are wondering, for example, can Senator John McCain mobilize the Christian right when it comes to the election? What's your view?
Well, we'll see. If he wins today and most of the Super Tuesday primaries, he will likely be the nominee. And then he's got several months to make the case that he is, in fact, credibly the Reagan Republican candidate. If California goes for Romney and maybe a couple of the other states, then the race could continue. But I think it's likely to be decided. McCain, the polls tell us, is likely to win enough states to make himself the front runner. And at that point, he just needs to walk through with people his track record and his vision. I think he'll have a united Republican Party, particularly if they're running against Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama in November.
I have to ask you an email question we got that came in from Springfield, Missouri, here in the USA, and a viewer said, and they want your comment on this, Barb Sonier says, I would have voted for John McCain 2 years ago, but not now. He'll continue the war policy, further bankrupt our country, and allow illegal aliens to stay. There isn't anyone running that really satisfies the masses. How do you rate the field of candidates?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think on the immigration issue, if there really was an anti-immigrant vote in the Republican primary, McCain wouldn't be winning. I tend to think people talk about it a lot, but don't tend to vote that way. I think one of the strongest arguments for McCain is that he's pro-immigrant. He recognizes that immigrants make the country stronger, and he will help the Republican Party, particularly with the Hispanic vote, because he's treated them with respect.
Well, let me get in Dr. Harris-Lacewell and ask to what extent has Barack Obama overcome the disillusionment of many voters? I mean, who's he winning over? Is he, for example, securing the African-American vote? Is he good for the African-American community with his policies?
Well, now that's two different questions. One is a question about sort of his capacity to mobilize the African-American vote. We don't have a lot of evidence on that yet. We'll know much more after the end of today. But certainly in South Carolina, he turned out to be a galvanizing figure. But it wasn't so much just Barack Obama. It was also the ways in which the Clintons behaved. So both former President Clinton and candidate Hillary Clinton behaved in ways that really upset the Southern Democratic, Black Democratic voters, and by the way, a substantial portion of white Southern Democratic voters who all turned out for Barack Obama, in part to punish the Clintons for racializing the primary. Now, then the second question is whether or not Barack Obama will be substantively a good president for African American interest. And I think the answer to that is yes. His interests in universal health care, the track record he has from the Illinois State Senate as well as the U.S. Senate in Illinois suggests that he's just the kind of centrist to liberal Democrat, which is going to be very, very good for black interests, both because he is fundamentally concerned about the issues that are central to African Americans, but also he has the capacity to actually build winning coalitions so that those issues can turn into real policy.
But I wondered, could he produce a good turnout in the South? The Democrat hasn't carried the South in decades. Could he change that?
Well, I think what we have to remember is that the White House is not the only game in any election. What you want in mobilizing Southern Democrats, particularly African Americans, is you want to be able to extend the lead of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives and hopefully also to really solidify the lead in the Senate. So in other words, taking the House and taking the Senate is the primary need for mobilizing a Southern Democratic base. It is unlikely in most Southern states, except for maybe Tennessee and Virginia, that the Democratic Party, regardless of the candidate, is likely to actually win enough to win the Electoral College votes. Tennessee and Virginia are up for grabs. Ohio's up for grabs. Maybe Florida if Barack Obama is running. But the real issue is you want to get those voters excited, get them out to the polls, because those are the voters that will give you a Democratic House and Senate.
Would you, Grover Norquist, would you expect any surprises in the South, watching the way the land's lying?
In today? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I think that Huckabee will do well. He's trying to make a play for Tennessee. In Georgia, there's a three-way race. That's sort of the most interesting state in terms of could go for any of the three, Huckabee, Romney, or McCain.
How hard has it been to gauge public opinion in this the run-up to this election, and the fact that the campaigning started so early?
Well, and you've also had, on the Republican side, quite a number of candidates. You had Giuliani, that a lot of people had parked their support there. A third of the Republicans said they were going to vote for him a few months ago. And then he faded because he didn't participate in the early primaries. He never lost, he just never got any traction. You had Thompson, that a lot of people thought they'd invested their hopes into, and that didn't quite ever take off. It's like a plane or a car that stalled. It didn't fail, it didn't get going. Then you had Romney, who was expected and supposed to win in Iowa and New Hampshire and then be off to the races. Didn't do either. And McCain was the only one who sort of had his strategy validated, which was win in New Hampshire and then have the press talk about you and get tens of millions of dollars in free publicity and move forward. So he was the one guy who sort of put his money down and on the thing that won.
So when the parties tried to front load the system, to what extent did it backfire?
Well, I guess it backfired against everybody except McCain. People had a different strategy. I mean, everybody knew the rules, so nobody was surprised. And they all had strategies. You could talk to the Romney people had a strategy, the Huckabee people had a strategy, the Giuliani people had a strategy, Thompson had a strategy. Their strategies didn't work. It wasn't that they had a strategy and the rules were changed. They knew what the rules were.
Well, let's get a caller in. We've got Ishan in Pakistan on the line. Ishan, what would you like to ask?
Sir, my question is, if John McCain wins the presidential election, will he continue the war of Iraq?
Okay, I'd like to put this to Grover Norquist. I mean, the question is really if will the war in Iraq continue if Senator McCain is in the White House?
Well, I presume the occupation of Iraq will continue. There'll be an effort to try and hand things more and more over to Iraq. But I suppose if there's a slow withdrawal of the U.S., it would continue under McCain as it would under Bush or a Democrat.
Right. Let's get a question here to Dr. Harris Lacewell, and we got an email that came in from one of our viewers who chose not to identify themselves, and they doubt that white Americans would support a black candidate. And the email that came in, the anonymous email that came in, was what white Americans have told the pollsters in the run-up to Super Tuesday and how they will actually vote once safely concealed behind the draw curtains of the voting booths will unmask their prejudice to the world. Now, to what extent do you think that's true? Are people being honest about what they feel about the candidates here?
So I think that's a reasonable concern, and it's one that's certainly rooted in the electoral history of the United States, where white Americans have often seemed to report one thing to pollsters and then do something else. Now, in this particular election, we have the case of Iowa, where white Americans did exactly what they said they were going to do in the state of Iowa. New Hampshire, where it looks like there was at least some group of middle-aged white women who did something different than they said they were going to do. And then in South Carolina, where in fact they supported Barack even more than they said they were going to. So there's no clear position here. We will see on Super Tuesday, but what I want to say is this. Remember that certainly there's a group of white Americans who will never vote for a black candidate. But that's okay. We don't need to try to campaign towards them. There's a whole group of white Americans who are actually excited about voting for a black candidate, who see in part Barack Obama's candidacy as an opportunity to move past the history of racism in America. They are also probably a relatively small group. And then in the middle is this vast population of white Americans who are willing to consider the possibility of a black candidate. And Barack Obama is just the sort of African American candidate, a kind of real uniter with a multiracial identity himself, who might in fact change these old patterns. I just want to say one quick thing about the polls too. Remember that the elections themselves are in some ways just a poll. If we were to go back to any of these states and run these elections and caucuses again a week later, you might have very different results. Every time is always just a snapshot. So it's not as though elections are the true preference and the polls are lies. It's just that at each and every moment in a dynamic process like this, attitudes and opinions are changing.
We've got a caller on the line from India. Good to have you there. I know it's late over there. Mustafa, what would you like to ask us?
Hello.
Hi.
I want to ask about the next policy of Democrat Party in Afghanistan issue.
Okay, well, let's see if Dr. Harris Lacewell could answer this. What on the issue of Afghanistan and where things stand, would you feel any particular change might occur under a Democratic White House?
Yeah, if anything, I will say this has been part of the disappointing part for someone who's a progressive like me, is that I feel that a sort of militaristic stance towards Afghanistan has become the way in which Democratic candidates who are against the war in Iraq are able to maintain their sort of position as strong military leaders. So what they say in these debates is what was wrong was going into Iraq. What we should have done is focus on Afghanistan. So I don't think there's any attempt on the part of Democrats, at least in their rhetoric, to pull back from a kind of imperial or militaristic stance towards much of the rest of the world. Instead, it's just sort of saying which countries ought we be focusing on. Right. And I think that's a real concern.
Well, let's get an email question here to Grover Norquist, and this came in from Kenya, from Farah Elmi in Nairobi. Obviously, there's a huge appetite for political change in this country, and this illustrates it. What Farah says is, what America needs is a president who won't start another war, will reduce the cost of gas, and will spend money on healthcare for children as opposed to the military. Now, listening to these concerns, what do you believe that the next occupant of the White House should put at the top of their priority list?
Well, Republicans and Democrat politicians have different priorities. A Republican president will continue the process of trying to reduce the tax burden. McCain says he wants to focus on reducing spending, and while you want to have a strong military, you don't want to have any unnecessary wars. So but the Democrats have a very different view. They want to spend a lot more money, and they want to raise taxes, and they want the trial lawyers to sue everybody. So somewhere one of those two will happen. So, well, the Afghans have to worry that a Democrat gets elected, he'll raise taxes on them.
I know that's your bugbear there, Grover. Let me get a call in from Shiktar in Sweden. Shiktar, what would you like to ask?
Well, I'm originally Kosovo Albanian, and I've seen the Kosovo issue disappearing from the political agenda during the primaries. That kind of upsets me, since Kosovo has become a matter of quite a disagreement between Russia and the rest of the Western world. So my question would actually be, do you see any differences on the stances between Democrats and Republicans on Kosovo? Which are the options?
I mean, beyond getting into specifics, Grover, if I could put that to you first, please.
Well, look, the rest of the world has to understand. Most Americans barely understand that Canada is the one to the north. And when you don't want the United States to know where your country is, chances are that causes problems. You're much better off if Americans and their president can neither pronounce nor find your country on the map.
Come on.
That's the safest place to hide out. But of course, the United States has messed around in Kosovo and actually has caused some troubles with the Russians back and forth, and their challenges. We didn't quite break Kosovo, but we're almost up there as we did with Iraq, and so there is some American requirements to make an effort to try and put things back together again. I don't know that there's a difference between how the Ds and the Rs see that.
Well, let's get to our professor in Princeton. I've got to ask you, when it comes to foreign policy, that's one of the things I feel a lot of critics of the U.S. At the moment have been saying has not been really fully thought out. That certainly under the Democrats there was more of an engagement policy. To what extent do you see signs of that with the current candidates running?
Again, so in an electoral season, I mean, this is exactly right. Candidates like to focus on issues that voters understand. And we have a saying in political science that talking about foreign policy during a campaign is waltzing before a blind audience. In other words, the American voters simply do not know or understand much about foreign policy. Now, the one area of foreign policy that American voters do understand is war. And they know I either am for the war or against the war. But they know very little about how to get in, how to get out, what the size of the embassy is, how many troops. I mean, those things are simply beyond the purview. So most people running for the U.S. presidency are going to focus on domestic pocketbook issues that are fundamental to the kind of day-to-day life of Americans. It's very parochial, it's very domestic, it's very closed, and that doesn't mean anything about what those policies are going to be like. These are just the electoral campaign strategies.
Now with a minute to go, I've got to give you 30 seconds each, and Dr. Harris-Lace, we'll start with you. Basically, if you had to have a Republican in the White House again, which one would it be?
Oh my gosh, that's painful. They're both liberals, so I suppose I'd be fine with either one, but I guess it'd have to be McCain.
All right, and Grover Norquist, if you had to, which one would offend you least?
As a candidate?
As a president, if you had to be a Democrat in the White House.
Oh dear, I would prefer to run against Hillary Clinton, but I just don't know enough about Obama in terms of wanting somebody in the White House.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us and giving us your views on where things stand on Super Tuesday. Of course, we'll keep an eye on what's going on.
Sure.
Great.
Thanks, both of you. And of course, a thank you to you for joining us. Don't forget, on tomorrow's program, we'll take an in-depth look at the Super Tuesday results in America and what they mean for women in politics. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts or if you want to add your voice to this, send us an email to riz@aljazeera.net. You'll be able to join us live on the show at this time tomorrow. Stay with us. Street Talk is coming up next.